In 1850, the west bank of St. Anthony Falls held a military sawmill, a handful of squatters, and nothing else you could call a town. 30 years later, Minneapolis was producing more flour than any city on the face of the earth, more than St. Louis, more than Budapest, more than Buffalo. And the population had gone from essentially zero to nearly 47,000 and climbing fast. By 1890, it would be 165,000. No harbor made this happen. No gold strike, no coal seam, no oil field, no silver lode. Just a waterfall. The only major waterfall on the entire length of the Mississippi River. And a series of bets so improbable that if any single one had gone the other way, there would be no Minneapolis at all. The falls were an accident of deep time. Roughly 10,000 years ago, as the last glaciers withdrew northward, the massive River Warren, a torrent draining glacial Lake Agassiz, poured over a ledge of hard Platteville limestone that sat atop a bed of soft St. Peter sandstone. Water carved through the soft rock. The limestone cap held, and the result was a waterfall roughly 50 feet high, stretching across the full breadth of the Mississippi. But the arrangement was unstable by design. The river was always chewing at the sandstone underneath the cap, always undermining the ledge, and the falls had been migrating upstream for millennia. By the time Father Louis Hennepin became the first European to see them in 1680, they had already traveled several miles from their original position near what is now downtown St. Paul. They were still moving. They would not stop. And that fact, the fragility of the very thing that made Minneapolis possible, would nearly destroy everything the city built. The United States Army established Fort Snelling at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers in 1819. For 2 decades, the fort was the only American outpost for hundreds of miles in any direction, and the land around the falls was a military reservation closed to civilian settlement. But the men who passed through could see what the waterfall was worth. A falls on a navigable river is a power source. It can drive sawmill blades, turn grinding stones, run looms, anything that needs a wheel turned, a belt driven, a shaft spinning. All you need is a dam, a canal, and a mill race. Franklin Steele was among the first to see it clearly. A storekeeper and sutler at Fort Snelling, Steele staked a claim on the east bank of the falls in 1838, the moment the land on that side was opened by treaty with the Dakota. He built a dam and a sawmill by 1848. The village of St. Anthony grew around his operation, a classic frontier mill settlement, muddy streets and pine board buildings, New England men arriving with capital and ambition. On the west bank, settlement came a few years later, after the military reservation was reduced. Minneapolis was incorporated as a city in 1856. St. Anthony, its twin across the falls, had been incorporated the year before. For 16 years, they stared at each other across the water, 2 separate cities sharing the same power source, competing for the same industries, until they merged in 1872 under the Minneapolis name. Before flour built the city, lumber made it rich. The white pine forests of northern Minnesota were dense and, to the men cutting them, seemingly limitless. Hundreds of miles of timber stretching north to the Canadian border. Loggers worked the woods through winters so cold that spit froze before it hit the ground, felling trees and skidding logs to frozen riverbanks to wait for the thaw. When the ice broke in spring, the great log drives began. Millions of board feet of timber came floating down the Mississippi and its tributaries in massive rafts and loose drives that jammed the river bank to bank for miles. River pigs, the men who walked the logs, breaking jams with peavies and pike poles, risking their lives in the freezing water, guided the timber downstream to the falls. At Minneapolis, the logs were caught in booms, sorted by the owner's marks stamped into each end, and fed into sawmills that screamed day and night on water power from the falls. The sawdust piled up along the riverbanks in drifts. The air downtown smelled of fresh-cut pine. By the 1870s, Minneapolis had become one of the largest lumber processing centers in the country, and the peak was still 2 decades away. The city's sawmills would not reach maximum output until around 1899. Fortunes were made. Thomas Barlow Walker, who had arrived from Ohio as a young man with modest capital and enormous energy, built a timber empire and then, with the proceeds, assembled one of the finest private art collections in the upper Midwest. His gallery, open to the public in his own home, would later form the nucleus of the Walker Art Center, today one of the country's leading museums of modern and contemporary art. But Walker and men like him could do arithmetic. The forests were not limitless. The pinelands were being cut at a pace that would exhaust them within a generation. And, in fact, the northern Minnesota forests were largely gone by the early 1900s. Minneapolis needed a second act. It needed something the falls could power and the prairies could supply indefinitely. It found flour. But flour, it turned out, had a problem that no one in Minneapolis could initially solve. Wheat was growing across the northern plains, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, the Western Territories. But the wheat that thrived in the short northern growing season was hard red spring wheat, and its bran was tougher than that of the soft winter wheat grown in the Ohio Valley and the mid-Atlantic states. When you ran spring wheat through traditional millstones, the bran shattered into dark specks and flecks of oily germ that discolored the flour and made it spoil quickly. The product was gritty, grayish, and unpopular. Fine white flour, the kind that sold at premium prices, came from winter wheat, and the winter wheat regions had their own mills closer to the eastern markets. Minneapolis, sitting atop an ocean of spring wheat, was stuck making a second-rate product for a second-rate price. This technical problem was the hinge on which the future of Minneapolis turned. Solve it, and the city owned the flour market of the continent. Fail, and Minneapolis would remain a respectable but unremarkable mill town. Another lumber camp that survived its trees, maybe, but nothing more. The breakthrough came from several directions at once. Edmond Lacroix, a French-born engineer working in Minneapolis, developed the Middlings purifier, a device that used carefully controlled air currents to separate bran particles from the middlings, the coarse granules of endosperm that conventional milling either wasted or downgraded. Cadwallader Washburn, a businessman from La Crosse, Wisconsin, and a former governor of that state, had built mills at the falls and was looking for any edge he could find. He hired Lacroix, invested heavily in refining the purifier, and the results exceeded anything the industry had expected. The device separated the bran cleanly, and what emerged was not merely acceptable white flour, but flour that was arguably superior to anything winter wheat could produce. Higher in protein, stronger in gluten, better for bread making. Minneapolis millers then adopted Hungarian-style steel roller mills to replace the old grinding stones, and the combination of the purifier and the rollers created what the trade began calling the new process. The effect was immediate and enormous. Spring wheat flour from Minneapolis went from an inferior product nobody wanted to a premium product everybody wanted. And it was not just equivalent to the old winter wheat flour, but demonstrably better for bread making, with higher protein and stronger gluten structure. The new process did not just save Minneapolis. It transformed the economy of the entire northern Great Plains. Suddenly, there was a premium market for every bushel of hard spring wheat the prairies could grow. Wheat poured into Minneapolis by rail in quantities that staggered the imagination. Mills expanded. New mills went up along the covered canal system beside the falls, drawing water from the river above the cataract. At the industry's height, more than 20 stone flour mills stood in a row along that canal. The water ran day and night. And then on the evening of May 2nd, 1878, the largest flour mill in the world blew apart. It was a Thursday. The day shift at the Washburn A Mill, a 7-story stone fortress on the West Bank, only 4 years old, employing roughly 200 men, had clocked out around 6 in the evening. The 14-man night crew had taken their stations. At approximately 7:20, a spark, probably from two dry millstones rubbing together, ignited flour dust suspended in the air of the poorly ventilated building. What happened next was not a fire. It was a detonation. An eyewitness later described seeing a stream of fire pour from the basement windows, then each floor above the basement becoming brilliantly illuminated, the light appearing simultaneously at the windows as the stories ignited one above the other. The walls cracked outward. The roof lifted and was hurled into the air. A column of black smoke shot upward, laced with what the witness said resembled lightning. Within minutes, the blast had spread to the adjacent Diamond and Humboldt mills. They exploded too. The concussion was felt 10 miles away in St. Paul, where residents ran into the streets thinking an earthquake had struck. 18 men were dead, 14 in the Washburn A, 4 in the neighboring mills. The iron roof of a nearby grain elevator fractured, and a piece of it flew 2 miles. The city's fire department fought the blaze through the night, but could not get close enough to the white heat of the ruins to have much effect. It was the worst industrial disaster in Minneapolis history, and the financial damage was staggering. More than $1 million in 1878 money, which translates to something north of $25 million today. Insurance companies initially refused to pay, arguing their policies covered fire, not explosions. The milling district had lost roughly a third of its capacity in a single night. The message could have been clear. Flour milling at this scale, in buildings this large, was too dangerous. The industry should disperse. The capital should go elsewhere. Cadwallader Washburn decided otherwise. Even as the ruins were still smoldering, he announced he would rebuild. By 1880, a new Washburn A Mill stood on the same site, larger, more advanced, and equipped with dust collection and ventilation systems designed by engineer William de la Barre that became the model for every major mill in the world. A memorial marker on the new building bore an inscription. Not one stone was left upon another, and every person engaged in the mill instantly lost his life. The rebuilt A Mill could grind enough flour to make 12 million loaves of bread a day. That same year, 1880, the Washburn Crosby Company entered its flour in the Millers International Exhibition in Cincinnati and won the gold medal. They named the product Gold Medal Flour, and the brand became one of the most recognized names in American grocery for the next century. The explosion, paradoxically, accelerated Minneapolis's dominance. Mills elsewhere that lacked the capital to install modern safety equipment fell behind or closed. Minneapolis, forced to innovate by catastrophe, emerged with the safest and most efficient mills on the continent. The cost of rebuilding was, in effect, the price of a monopoly. Now the competition sharpened. On one side stood the Washburn Crosby Company, the operation Cadwallader Washburn had built with his partner John Crosby. On the other stood Charles Alfred Pillsbury, a New Hampshire man who had arrived in Minneapolis in 1869 at the age of 27 with nothing to recommend him but energy and family money. Pillsbury bought a half interest in a small, struggling flour mill, and within a decade had transformed it into the largest milling operation in the city. The Pillsbury A Mill, completed in 1881 on the east bank of the Falls, was built of native limestone and could produce, at peak capacity, 12,000 barrels of flour a day, as much as any single mill on earth. The rivalry between Washburn Crosby and Pillsbury was not personal hatred. It was the kind of competition that builds cities. Both companies invested relentlessly in the latest technology. Both expanded capacity year after year. Both drove demand for wheat, which drove railroad construction, which brought more settlers to the prairies, which grew more wheat. The cycle fed itself. By 1884, Minneapolis mills were producing more flour than the next 3 American milling cities combined. In 1916, at the industry's peak, 25 flour mills near the Falls employed 2,000 to 2,500 workers and produced 18.5 million barrels of flour, over 20% of the nation's entire output. The wealth remade the city in stone. This was not a boom town throwing up clapboard saloons and false front general stores. The milling families and the merchant class that served them built Minneapolis as if they expected it to endure for centuries. The West Hotel, designed by the architect Leroy Buffington and opened on November 19, 1884, had 407 guest rooms, an immense lobby filled with marble and stained glass that was said to be the largest hotel lobby in the country, and a guest list that eventually included Mark Twain and Winston Churchill. 500 guests attended the opening banquet, a $10 a plate affair, which in 1884 was a serious sum, and the city of Minneapolis presented the hotel's founder with a $5,000 silver urn made by Tiffany. The West Hotel was, for a time, considered the finest hotel between Chicago and the Pacific Coast. In 1892, it hosted delegates to the Republican National Convention, the convention that renominated Benjamin Harrison for president, an event that would have been unthinkable in the same location just 20 years earlier, when the site was prairie. The Minneapolis City Hall and Hennepin County Courthouse, begun in 1888 and not fully completed until 1906, was a massive Richardsonian Romanesque edifice of granite with a clock tower that dominated the skyline. It took 18 years to complete, and the cost ran to roughly $3.5 million, an astonishing figure for a city that had barely existed 40 years earlier. Nicollet Avenue became the commercial spine of the city. Department stores, banks, office buildings, theaters, a street where you could walk a mile under continuous awnings and never run out of plate glass. In 1890, the Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building opened on 3rd Street, 12 stories of green New Hampshire granite and red Lake Superior sandstone, with an interior light court that soared the full height of the building, ringed with ornamental iron balconies, flooded with natural light from a massive skylight. It was the tallest commercial building in Minneapolis. People called it the Metropolitan Building, and later simply the Met. It was, by most accounts, one of the finest interior spaces in any American commercial building of its era. Remember that building. It comes back. The population figures from this period are worth sitting with because they represent one of the steepest urban growth curves in American history. In 1870, Minneapolis had 13,000 people. By 1880, nearly 47,000. By 1890, 165,000. By 1900, more than 200,000. People came from New England, bringing mercantile ambitions and Yankee capital. They came from Scandinavia in enormous numbers, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, until Minneapolis was one of the most heavily Scandinavian cities in America, a place where you could hear Swedish spoken on the streetcars and buy a Norwegian newspaper on Nicollet Avenue. They came from Germany, from Ireland, from the farms of the upper Midwest. They came because the mills were hiring, the railroads were hiring, the lumber companies were hiring, and the city that all of it had built was hiring everyone else: clerks, teachers, doctors, carpenters, grocers, barbers, the whole human infrastructure that a real city requires. Minneapolis by 1890 had electric streetcars, parks designed by the landscape architect Horace Cleveland along the chain of lakes, a public library, and a growing sense that it was not just a milling town anymore, but a genuine metropolitan center, even if the milling was what paid for everything. The 1890 census produced one of the more entertaining chapters in the Twin Cities rivalry. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul, the state capital just 10 miles downriver, the older and more established city, headquarters of James J. Hill's railroad empire, were desperate to claim the larger population. Census takers in both cities padded the rolls with abandon: dead people, non-existent boarding houses, addresses that did not exist. St. Paul hired a private detective to infiltrate the ranks of Minneapolis census workers. On the night of June 17, 1890, a U.S. Marshal from St. Paul burst into a room where Minneapolis census takers were working and arrested 7 of them, seizing 6 sacks of census papers. Minneapolis officials tried to recover the papers with a warrant. St. Paul police drew their guns and turned them away. The Minneapolis Journal printed the headline, "It Means War." A federal investigation expunged thousands of fraudulent names from both cities' counts. The corrected totals gave Minneapolis 164,581 and St. Paul 133,156. Minneapolis had won, but neither city emerged with much dignity. There is something else that happened during these years that the story requires, because without it you cannot understand what Minneapolis really is. In October 1869, 9 years before the mill explosion, contractors digging a tunnel beneath Hennepin Island struck disaster. The tunnel was supposed to channel river water to mills on the east bank. William Eastman and John Merriam, the businessmen behind the project, had purchased most of Nicollet Island and dreamed of harnessing the falls from a new angle. Their workers dug through the soft sandstone beneath the limestone riverbed for a year without incident. Then, on the morning of October 4th, 1869, the men returning from their weekend found water seeping into the tunnel. They thought it was a minor problem. By noon, the seep had become a flow, and the workers were driven out. The next morning, Tuesday, October 5th, the river broke through. The thin limestone cap over the tunnel collapsed. Water roared into the breach, scouring the opening wider, 16.5 feet deep, 90 feet across, and the entire limestone shelf that formed the falls began to crumble. Chunks of the ledge fell into a churning whirlpool that opened in the middle of the river. Sinkholes appeared along the banks. Buildings near the water shifted on their foundations. Word spread instantly. One witness recalled that proprietors of stores rushed to the falls, dragging their clerks with them. Bakers abandoned their ovens. Lumbermen were ordered out of the sawmills. Everyone understood what was happening. St. Anthony Falls was dying. It was entirely possible that the limestone would break apart, the sandstone would wash out, and what had been a 50-foot waterfall would become nothing more than a long stretch of useless rapids. Every mill on both banks would be stranded without power. The entire economy of both cities, everything that had been built in the previous 20 years, would collapse. Hundreds of volunteers rushed to the site. They dumped timber cribs packed with stone into the breach. The river washed them out. They built cofferdams. The spring floods of 1870 tore them up. More sinkholes opened. A flour mill, a planing mill, and a wheat storehouse were undermined and tipped into the river. The crisis dragged on for years. Eventually, the United States Army Corps of Engineers intervened with federal money. $615,000 in 1870s currency, and built a concrete curtain wall beneath the riverbed, 40 feet tall, 6 feet thick at the base, 1,850 feet across, buried in the sandstone upstream of the falls to stop the water from carving new paths underneath. They laid a concrete apron over the entire face of the falls. By the time the work was done, St. Anthony Falls was as much a work of engineering as a work of nature. The waterfall that powered the flower capital of the world was, in a meaningful sense, artificial, held together by concrete, because the alternative was losing everything. This is the fact that organizes the whole story of Minneapolis. The city was built on a natural advantage that was never as solid as it appeared. The limestone was always eroding. The sandstone was always soft. The falls were always moving, always vulnerable. And the people of Minneapolis reinforced them with concrete and steel because the entire economy, the mills, the railroads, the banks, the hotels, the fortunes, the opera house they opened before half the roads were paved, depended on a geological feature that wanted to disappear. The Foshay Tower is the monument that captures both the confidence and the fragility of all this in a single building. Wilbur Foshay was a utilities magnate, a man who had arrived in Minneapolis from the East Coast in 1915, $150,000 in debt, and within a decade had assembled an empire of power companies stretching across 23 states and 5 foreign countries. In the late 1920s, he decided to build himself a monument, a 32-story tower modeled on the Washington Monument, an obelisk of concrete and Indiana limestone rising 447 feet above Marquette Avenue. Each floor 4 inches smaller than the one below it, the name Foshay spelled out in 10-foot lighted letters on all 4 sides near the top. It cost $3.75 million, and it was, when completed, the tallest building in Minneapolis and one of the tallest in the entire Midwest. For the dedication held August 30th, 1929, Foshay invited 25,000 guests and paid the travel expenses of cabinet members, senators, and congressmen. Half-nude dancers entertained. Each guest received a gold pocket watch. The military fired a 19-gun salute, and John Philip Sousa, the March King himself, 74 years old, conducted his band in the premiere of a composition he had written for the occasion, the Foshay Tower Washington Memorial March. Foshay handed Sousa a check for $20,000. It was the high point of Wilbur Foshay's life. It was also the only time he ever heard the march performed. Weeks later, the stock market crashed. Foshay's empire, built on leverage and what turned out to be a pyramid of his own stock, collapsed instantly. His company went into receivership on November 2nd. He was indicted, convicted of mail fraud, and sentenced to 15 years in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And the check he had written to John Philip Sousa bounced. As the story is told in Minneapolis, and it has been told so many times that it has acquired the hardness of fact whether or not every detail is precisely true, Sousa refused to allow the march to be performed again as long as the debt remained unpaid. Foshay served 3 years, was released, and eventually received a full pardon from President Harry Truman. The march was not played publicly again for decades. Foshay himself moved back to Minneapolis after years in Colorado and Arizona, broke, his fortune entirely gone. He died on August 30th, 1957, the 28th anniversary to the day of his tower's dedication, in a convalescent home without a penny to his name, in the shadow of the building that still bore his name in 10-foot letters. The Foshay Tower still stands on Marquette Avenue. It is dwarfed now by a dozen taller structures, most prominently the IDS Center, the 57-story glass tower that Philip Johnson designed, completed in 1972, the building that finally surpassed the Foshay after 43 years. But for a few weeks in the late summer of 1929, the Foshay Tower was the tallest thing between Chicago and the Pacific, and the man who built it was weeks away from prison. The flower era did not end in a crash. It ended in a slow migration of the industry away from the falls, driven by economics that no amount of civic pride could reverse. New milling technology, electric motors, steel rollers powered by electricity rather than water, meant that mills no longer needed to sit beside a waterfall. They could be built anywhere with rail access and a power line, which meant they could be built closer to the wheat fields, cutting transportation costs significantly. Federal regulators at the Interstate Commerce Commission eliminated the preferential freight rates that railroads had quietly granted Minneapolis millers for decades, the special favors that had helped build the empire in the first place. The wheat itself was changing. The bonanza farms of the Red River Valley, those enormous industrial-scale operations that had fed Minneapolis's mills with trainloads of hard spring wheat, were seeing declining soil fertility after decades of single-crop agriculture. Meanwhile, southeastern farms began adopting harder wheat varieties of their own, eroding Minneapolis's near monopoly on premium bread flour. Buffalo, positioned at the eastern end of the Great Lakes shipping lanes and closer to the massive eastern consumer markets, became a serious rival. And here was the bitter irony. It was Minneapolis capital that built Buffalo's rise. In 1904, Washburn Crosby had opened its first mill in Buffalo. By 1927, Washburn, Crosby, and Pillsbury together accounted for nearly 80% of Buffalo's flour capacity. Minneapolis companies were, in effect, competing against themselves. In 1930, Buffalo officially surpassed Minneapolis in flour production, 11 million barrels to Minneapolis's 10.8 million. The city that had held the title for half a century lost it, and it was never coming back. But the companies themselves endured, even as the mills at the falls did not. In 1921, the Washburn Crosby Company had created a fictional character named Betty Crocker to answer customer letters about baking. The name Betty, chosen for its cheerful sound, Crocker, an homage to a former company director. She became one of the most recognized figures in American kitchens for the rest of the century. In 1928, Washburn Crosby merged with 28 other milling companies to form General Mills, a corporation whose headquarters remained in Minneapolis, even as its actual milling operations dispersed across the country. Pillsbury continued under its own name for decades. The brands survived and prospered. The mills at the falls did not. They closed one by one, the Washburn A shutting down in 1965, and the Pillsbury A, the very last flour mill on the Minneapolis riverfront, ceasing operations in 2003. But before the last mill fell silent, the city did something to itself that remains one of the most debated decisions in Minneapolis history. In the 1950s and early 1960s, flush with federal urban renewal money, $13 million from Washington, the city embarked on a massive demolition program centered on the Gateway District, the oldest commercial neighborhood in downtown Minneapolis. By mid-century, Gateway had declined from its origins as the commercial heart of the young city into what officials called Skid Row, flop houses, missions, pawn shops, bars, men on the sidewalks with nowhere else to go. The city's response was to level nearly 200 structures across 22 blocks, roughly 40% of the downtown core. The defining loss was the Metropolitan Building. Remember it? The 12-story Romanesque masterpiece with the soaring interior light court, the ornamental ironwork, the skylight flooding the atrium with daylight. By the 1960s, it sat on the edge of the Gateway District, and the city classified it as blighted, though records show it was structurally sound and nearly fully occupied at the time it was condemned. The building came down not because it was failing, but because it was in the wrong neighborhood. Demolition began on December 18, 1961, despite a public campaign to save it, one of the earliest preservation battles in Minneapolis, and some would argue, in the country. Architects, historians, and university professors pleaded to spare the building. They lost. The site became a parking lot. The loss of the Metropolitan Building did something that its preservation might never have accomplished. It galvanized a movement. The Minneapolis Heritage Preservation Commission was established in 1971, a direct consequence of the civic grief over what had been destroyed. The Gateway clearance came to be regarded, by planners, historians, and the city's own residents, as the single largest planning mistake in Minneapolis history. Most of the leveled blocks sat as surface parking lots for decades. The old town was gone, and nothing of equal character replaced it. What Minneapolis built next, among other things, was a city in the sky. In 1962, a local real estate developer named Leslie Park, alarmed by the flight of business to the suburbs — General Mills had already left downtown for a campus in Golden Valley, and the Southdale Shopping Center had opened in a former cornfield in Edina, pulling retail away from the urban core — commissioned architect Edward Baker to design something new: an enclosed, climate-controlled pedestrian bridge connecting his newly built North Star Center to the Northwestern Bank building across Marquette Avenue. Park's logic was simple. Minneapolis winters are savage. Temperatures drop to 20 and 30 below. Wind scours the open prairies and funnels through downtown canyons. If you could connect buildings above street level, you could create a parallel city where office workers, shoppers, and visitors moved from building to building in shirt sleeves, never setting foot outside. He called it a skyway. It worked. Other developers added connections. The city incentivized them. By the time the IDS Center opened in 1972, with skyway links in all 4 directions, the scattered segments began to fuse into a true system. Today, the Minneapolis Skyway network is the largest continuous indoor pedestrian system in the world. Roughly 80 blocks connected by over 9 miles of enclosed walkways linking office towers, hotels, banks, restaurants, sports arenas, retail stores, and at least 1 church. You can walk from the convention center to the central library to Target headquarters without touching a sidewalk. A travel writer once spent 2 weeks in a Minneapolis winter wearing cargo shorts and a t-shirt, never leaving the skyway-connected apartment and offices and shops that make up this indoor city. The skyways also, depending on whom you ask, pulled the life off the street. Pedestrian traffic moved upstairs. Storefronts at ground level lost their walking trade. Nicollet Mall, the pedestrian priority thoroughfare that the city built in 1967, designed by the landscape architect Lawrence Halprin, with transit and pedestrians only, no private cars, was supposed to be the great public street of downtown Minneapolis. The skyways drew much of the activity indoors, 1 floor up, invisible from the sidewalk. The same innovation that solved the winter problem created a new one. A downtown that could feel deserted at street level, even while thousands of people moved through it overhead. This is perhaps the final irony of Minneapolis, a city whose story is built entirely on ironies. A city built on a natural feature that was never as natural as it looked. A waterfall held together by concrete. An industry that thrived because of a catastrophic explosion. A monument to ambition built by a man about to go to prison. A preservation movement born from the one building it failed to save. And now a downtown kept alive in winter by glass bridges that drained the vitality from the very streets they were built to serve. The falls are still there. If you walk across the Stone Arch Bridge, the beautiful railroad viaduct that James J. Hill built in 1883 for $650,000, 2,100 feet of granite and limestone arches curving across the river just below the falls, once called Hill's Folly, and now a pedestrian and bicycle path, you can look upstream at St. Anthony Falls. The concrete apron the Army Corps laid down more than 140 years ago is visible, a smooth gray slope over which the Mississippi pours in a broad white curtain. The Pillsbury A Mill stands on the east bank, its limestone walls intact, converted to apartments now. On the west bank, the ruins of the Washburn A Mill hold the Mill City Museum, a museum about the industry that created the city, housed inside the shell of the building where 18 men died and a fortune was rebuilt from the rubble. Underneath the riverbed, somewhere below the limestone cap, the concrete cut-off wall that the Corps buried in 1876 is still doing its work. No one has inspected it. No one is certain who owns it. No one knows exactly what condition it is in. A 2021 Army Corps report acknowledged that if it failed, the falls would erode into rapids, and the head-cutting erosion would extend far upstream, threatening bridges, roads, and the drinking water supply for 1 million people in the Twin Cities. The falls drop roughly 50 feet. They are the reason the city exists. They are held together with concrete. And the river, as it has for 10,000 years, is still wearing them away.